On July 19th, 1977, the world teacher, the Christ Maitreya, head of the spiritual hierarchy, emerged from his ancient retreat and is now in the modern world. With his disciples, the masters of the wisdom, he will inaugurate the new age of synthesis and brotherhood.
Good morning and welcome to our World Teacher Programme on Wellington's Access Radio 106.1 FM, presented by Teresa and David on behalf of Share International New Zealand.
While browsing through our previous programmes, I found this interesting article from June 2007. It certainly merits a rerun, as the article describes the social, political and economic conditions that Jesus had to contend with. It's also interesting to note the correspondence between the environment that Jesus came into and that into which Maitreya emerges today. The article is by Betty Stockbauer and is entitled Jesus and His Times. She begins by saying,
"There are few studies in the world as fraught with intangibles as are those of the career and thoughts of Jesus Christ. Even though he is the most studied personage in Western civilization, scholars are still plagued with questions about practically every aspect of his life. Each new book portrays him in a different light. Some see him as God and some as man. Some paint him as a political revolutionary, some as a meek and beneficent teacher. Still others claim he was purely mythical and question his very physical existence."
The purpose of this article is to look into his times and investigate the challenges which he faced as a highly evolved human being living in a world on the verge of vast and tumultuous change. His era was one of the bloodiest, most greed-filled epochs of recorded history. His own Jewish people a fragmented society. As a man of intense power and charisma, he became a focal point for both raging hatred and intense love.
In contrast to the highest divinity with which he is endowed by the Christian churches, this article will emphasize his humanity because, as a third-degree initiate approaching the fourth initiation of renunciation, he was not yet totally free of earthly conflict. Statements from Maitreya and the Master Dwal Kul, as well as certain biblical myths, will illuminate specific obstacles that lay before him as he approached the fourth initiation.
In the Gospel of Luke, we find recounted the story of the temptations of Jesus. We read that after his baptism, he went out into the wilderness to fast and pray. There, in the stark silence of the Judean desert, appeared to him a devil who tempted him in 3 ways.
First, he offered him food to break his 40-day fast. Then he tempted him with worldly riches and power. Lastly, he took him to Jerusalem and set him on the parapet of the temple, telling him to throw himself down, to demonstrate his spiritual powers for all to see by calling on the angels of God to raise him up again. Despite the long and strenuous deprivation of his desert fast, Jesus withstood each temptation. In the end, we read, the devil departed, biding his time.
What does this story mean in relation to the earthly mission of Jesus Christ? Was it purely symbolic, or was it a true presage of things to come, an omen of the difficulties before him in the completion of his mission? If we view it as the latter, then we can see why the devil bided his time, for the temptations in the desert followed him throughout his life. With this thought in mind, let us look into his era and see what Jesus faced as a man of flesh and blood, an elder brother on the path of life.
The philosophic ideas which laid the groundwork for the Piscean era were born in 500 BC, during the golden days of Greece. There its great philosophers, Pythagoras, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Isocrates taught equality, world federation and the brotherhood of man. There developed the arts, architecture, science and philosophy. There lived a leisure society, liberal in outlook, with a taste for elegant living and an admiration for daring feats of physical prowess. This influence, called the Hellenistic, was said to have spread widely throughout the Mediterranean world in the centuries before Christ.
But over time, the Grecian love of refinement became degraded into a coarse desire for luxurious living, its liberal ways degenerating into pure licentiousness. Athletic games were adopted by the later Roman Empire, but evolved into gladiatorial contests, which uselessly took the lives of many slaves and Christian martyrs. In some societies, the Greek influence was welcomed, but in others it was considered abhorrent and sacrilegious. Nevertheless, the common language and culture it brought acted as a unifying factor throughout the Mediterranean. It greatly facilitated both the expansion of the Roman Empire and the later spread of Christianity.
In the 1st century AD, the Roman Empire was at the height of political power. Its geographic boundaries stretched from the north of England to the banks of the Euphrates, and from the river Danube to the entire northern coast of Africa. It was an early example of federation, showing that a large population with an internal diversity of cultures could coexist under one government. It persisted as a single political system for 6 centuries, 200 BC to AD 400, a feat ranking as one of the greatest political achievements in history.
This achievement was bought, though, at great and bloody cost to the nations which were conquered. The Roman wars of conquest are famous for their tenacity, and did not end until every country surrounding the Mediterranean was under its power.
Rome itself had 1 million inhabitants, and although it had no industry, nor even relied on trade, it was the wealthiest city of the empire, because into its coffers was accumulated vast and continuous treasure, the booty of war from conquered lands. Into its provinces were brought thousands of slaves, another spoil of war.
When its wars of conquest ended, Rome turned to ever-increasing taxation to maintain its former standard of living. The lower classes were particularly affected. What great bitterness they must have felt, knowing of the colossal works of architecture, the lavish spending of the leaders, the expensive gladiatorial contests that so thoughtlessly consumed their hard-won earnings.
Rome's religion included a polyglot of deities. Most honoured were Jupiter and Mars, the gods of war. Sacrifice was offered to the gods to obtain favour or prevent catastrophe. Emphasis was often on material and personal gain. Such a religion offered little to the lower classes, often unable to secure the mere minimum for survival, or to the earnest seeker of spiritual truth. Many worshippers were drawn to other religions which could be found in the vast Roman state.
Mithraism, imported from Persia and India, taught a doctrine of the sun god, a god of light and righteousness. The Isis religion from Egypt emphasized wisdom and knowledge. The mystery religions from Greece offered initiation ceremonies of ritual purification. All of these countered the Roman emphasis on worldly material achievement by offering the promise of salvation and the hope of immortality.
The Master D.K. in Alice Bailey's book, The Rays and the Initiations, speaks of the advent on our planet of cosmic evil, describing it as that which is not indigenous to the planet, but which, because of the extreme decadence of the times, found an entry in Roman days. It was a resurgence of the ancient evil of Atlantis, whose major sin was theft, widespread and general.
He says, heights of luxury were reached in Atlantis, of which we, with all our boasted civilization, know nothing, and have never achieved. Likewise in Rome, life became tainted by the miasma of unadulterated selfishness, and the very springs of life itself became polluted. Men only lived and breathed in order to be in possession of the utmost luxury, and of a very plethora of things and of material goods. They were smothered by desire, and plagued by the dream of never dying, but of living on and on, acquiring more and more of all that they desired.
The most physically outstanding fact of Jesus' life, one overlooked by many Christians, is that he was a Jew. He had a long and illustrious association with the Jewish race. In the Old Testament, his past lifetimes are mentioned as Joshua, son of Nun, successor to Moses, as Jeshua in the book of Ezra, and again as Joshua in the book of Zechariah.
During his life as Jesus, most of his followers were Jews, and the early Christian church was simply another branch of Judaism. Its members had to submit to Jewish laws of diet and circumcision before joining. This is important to comprehend because the cultural background of this period of Judaism gives us a matrix in which to understand many of Jesus' statements and actions.
When Jesus was born, Judaism was at a crossroads. Its membership was split into various competing groups, some of them in bitter contention. Hellenistic influences were adopted by the more liberal Jews, but were considered an abomination to the Orthodox. A lust for wealth and power, brought by the Roman influence, seeped into the upper echelons of Jewish society, whose aristocratic members were called the Sadducees. They lived in splendour amid the general poverty of the peasant classes.
Even the high priests, who offered the temple sacrifices, had become thoroughly corrupt, pawns of whatever political regime was in power. This became a grievous offence to the Orthodox, who believed in an orderly line of succession and a priesthood free from outside corruption. Groups such as the Essenes made an almost complete break with mainstream Judaism and established their own colonies and rituals, though still holding closely to the Mosaic Code.
Judaism's great contributions to the world of thought lie first in its monotheism, its total adherence to the God it knew as Yahweh, and second in its code of laws, the bedrock of the faith. The Pharisees and the scribes were the groups that studied and interpreted the Mosaic Code. They held the real influence in the religion and were often known for their great sanctity.
However, by Jesus' time, empty external ritual had become a substitute for true morality, and those who kept alive the true esoteric teachings of Judaism were persecuted by the Pharisees. This group's true conflict with Jesus was that he was willing to open the secret tradition to the masses and establish a religion based on knowledge of the sacred laws of being.
Because they considered their relationship with Yahweh so personal and sacred, the Jewish people developed an idea of themselves as a chosen people, uniquely picked by God as his favourites, destined eventually to rule his kingdom, the whole of humanity. For many centuries their prophets have been speaking of this messianic kingdom to come, warning the people to repent and prepare themselves.
You're listening to the World Teacher Programme on Wellington's Access Radio 106.1 FM. When Judea came under Roman rule in 63 BC, Judaism was thrown into a continuous state of agitation. New, politically motivated groups formed. The zealots, outspoken, charismatic and often militaristic, were bitterly opposed to Rome and to any Jews who curried its favour. The Sicarii, dagger men, were even more radical. With hidden weapons they mingled in crowds and assassinated traitors who sided with the Romans.
From the ranks of these radical groups issued a succession of leaders, many of them claiming to be the long-awaited Messiah. Gathering followers, they agitated in the cities or worked underground in the wilderness areas, where they would lead guerrilla actions against passing imperial troops. The Romans kept a close watch on these political rebels and became increasingly wary of all such activity in the Jewish lands.
In the light of this situation, it is obvious why Jesus made so little historical impact on his day, as he was probably seen as a mere political agitator. Already the Romans had crucified or otherwise slaughtered thousands of such rebels. Before the final Jewish protests would be over in AD 135, the slain Jews would number well over 1 million. Jesus was just one more.
The Jerusalem temple was the centre of devout worship for millions of Jews, considered to be the dwelling place of Yahweh, the living God. On its altars every day over 700 clergy offered sacrifice. A yearly succession of festivals attracted Jews from many lands.
As an institution, however, it had strayed far from its spiritual purpose, for in addition to being a house of worship, it had become, in effect, a bank. A temple tax was levied on all Jews. Sacrificial offerings prescribed by the priests involved the purchase of animals and payment of currency exchange fees. The lower classes, already cruelly overtaxed by the Roman overlords, were burdened even further. All of this money was in turn reinvested or lent out. Since interest rates in Roman times were high, sometimes 50%, a constant flow of income daily swelled the temple treasures.
When Jesus set his face resolutely towards Jerusalem, the city he entered was a conflagration of religious and political tensions. Here we see played out the dualities of his life. Entering as a king, he was subsequently executed as the lowest criminal. On every side he could undoubtedly see the signs of poverty of his people and their great longing for freedom, for the coming of God's kingdom. Likewise he knew that the heart of his opposition presided here in the centre of power. The Bible says he knew beforehand that death awaited him.
It is generally believed that his attack on the money changers in the Temple of Jerusalem is the action which crystallized the opposition to his work. Seen in view of the political realities of temple life, it was an act of pure courage, aimed at an institution symbolizing the height of both Roman and Jewish decadence.
It was Caiaphas, the high priest of the Jerusalem temple, we are told, who led the resistance to Jesus, and Caiaphas had been elected by a Roman governor. In order to ensure continuing patronage, Caiaphas would have countered any Jewish zealots stirring up opposition to Roman rule. Jesus' attack would have been viewed as dangerous and seditious, considering his large number of followers. It could not help but bring down severe repercussions.
Many are the choices that he could have made in Jerusalem. He could have used his powers to lead an uprising of the people, thereby following the way of so many of his co-religionists. He could have courted favour with the Romans and become a temporal leader of wealth and repute. Or he could simply have returned to Galilee and lived out his life as a quiet Jewish rabbi.
Ultimately, he chose a way that confounded nearly everyone. His action in the temple angered not only the temple priests and the Romans, but surely alienated many of his followers. The Orthodox among them may have been scandalized by his attack on an institution they considered sacred. The Zealots by his failure to follow through with even more radical dissent.
When arrested, his meek submission to the Roman authorities may have confused the apostles. We are told by Blavatsky that he had considerable magical powers, and had instructed the apostles in their use. They knew that he could simply escape his captors, and had done so on other occasions. That he chose not to may have been one of his greatest tests, a total renunciation of the life of the world.
The path that leads to the cross of the fourth initiation of renunciation is marked by conflict. On every side the initiate finds discord, duality and contradiction. The true course lies somewhere between, in an approach which expresses a new and wholly different quality. Only by a finely developed discrimination can the proper way be found. Jesus resolved the dualities he faced in forgiveness and an awareness of the unity of all beings.
Maitreya tells us, the experiences the Lord gave Jesus are being given to certain disciples today. But in the case of Jesus, his mind initially became possessive of those experiences. The mind tried to use these spiritual powers to achieve certain goals. He began to preach. Jesus was concerned about disparities between rich and poor, and he became attached to that which he wanted to achieve, justice. Therefore, his teaching was relative because it was submerged in opposites. Maitreya says that, in the eyes of the Lord, no one is rich or poor. Jesus should have taught at that time, be not attached to riches or poverty. When you try to preach, you create nothing but limitation. The true teaching is, I am with you if you are honest, sincere, detached.
In these statements we see some of the challenges confronting Jesus, the testing of the wise use of his spiritual powers, analogious to the third temptation in the desert. They tell us that he was subject to the influences around him, and could temporarily be diverted by his own emotions and goals. He was limited, as is every entity which takes physical incarnation, from the smallest molecule to the logos of a planet.
At our level, we cannot hope to understand the vast parameters of the challenges he faced. The most telling evidence we have is his passion in the Garden of Gethsemane. The agony experienced there testifies to the dreadful import of the decisions he made, when he achieved the subjugation of his own lower will and a quest to a higher will, that of the monad, which he had always called his Father in heaven.
Maitreya says that Jesus had doubts until his final hours, but when he cried, my Lord, why hast thou forsaken me?" he was given a vision. He understood then that the mind should not run after spiritual forces. Maitreya also said, when Jesus was on the cross, I was by the side of both crucified and crucifier. When Jesus saw this, he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. In this way, he realized in mind, spirit, and body that the relative and the absolute are the two sides of light. Then silence prevailed. He was satisfied.
That he succeeded in his mission is certain. He anchored on the earth certain energies of love and will which have opened the door to vast possibilities for human accomplishment. In addition, he left a legacy for all who would follow. His life and work is a promise that we too, though we stumble and fall, can ultimately achieve the greatest of goals. We can aspire to his powers, overcome death, and find resurrection.
Perhaps that is exactly what he meant to give us, the true light he cast upon the path. In truth, in very truth I tell you, he who has faith in me will do what I am doing, and he will do greater things still. Therein lies our hope, our future, and the possibility of our true at-one-ment with God.
The Master D.K. tells us that the first 2 centuries of the Christian era were marked by radiatory activity, which stimulated in many souls an intense striving for a higher expression of spirituality. In all such times, highly evolved individuals are born to hasten the thrust of the evolutionary impulse.
This is what happened in Jesus' day. Beginning with the apostles, there can be traced for 200 years a line of teachers who promulgated his ideas in a more or less clear form. Their documents are the most ardent of testimonies to the work he accomplished. Their single-mindedness and courage in the face of opposition ensured that a thread of his teaching would be left for the future world.
That concludes the article by Betty Stockbauer.
On the 29th of December 2006, Benjamin Creme was interviewed by a well-known American TV chat show host for a film about world religions. At the end of the interview, Maitreya gave a blessing, accompanied by this message:
I am closer to you than you may think. No distance separates us. And I can tell you truly that it is not long before you see my face. Be arduous in the task of telling the world of my presence, and bring joy to humankind.
If you would like to know more about the emergence of Maitreya and his teachings, our phone number is 06 3646 101. Or if you would like to discuss any aspect of this program, the number again is 06 3646 101. Our next World Teacher program will be on Saturday, the 12th of August, at the usual time of 10 a.m.
To order books and video and audio tapes, the number is 04 234 1133. We also have a free-of-charge monthly newsletter which contains a small selection of articles from the current edition of Share International magazine. That number again is 04 234 1133. The website is share-international.org. You can also write to us at P.O. Box 9576 Wellington.
You have been listening to Teresa and David on behalf of Share International New Zealand. You can listen again to this program or previous ones online at accessradio.org.nz. Click on Programs and scroll down to the World Teacher link.